It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest, Rory Carroll. He's the correspondent for the United States West Coast Bureau for The Guardian. He's been with The Guardian since the 1990s and covered Southern Europe, Baghdad, and Africa before spending 6 years covering South America from Caracas, Venezuela. During that posting, he got a close look at President Hugo Chavez's regime and published a book about it called Comandante, Hugo Chavez Venezuela, which was published in 2013. Tonight, he joins us to talk about the long-lasting effects of Chavez's rule and the economic and political unrest in Venezuela today. Rory, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction, and to the World Affairs Council for the invitation, and everybody for coming out here on a Monday night. It's great to see so many people interested in Venezuela.
So let's start off with Venezuela and go back in history, because here you have a situation when you look around the world today that Venezuela is in our backyard. It's essentially a failed state. It's having tough times coming up with the foreign exchange reserves to pay off its bond debt. People are having a very tough time, getting their money out of the bank. Inflation last year was 2,600%, and in December alone it was 85%. But in the 70s and the early 80s, Venezuela was a model for Latin American growth. It was a really amazing country. Talk to us about what Venezuela was like in the 70s and 80s, and what brought us to the coup that President Hugo Chavez brought in 1992.
It's been an astonishing arc for this country, which had been going back a century, a sort of tin pot dictatorship in a way. It was like a big ranch, and then they discovered oil. And so successive strongmen were able to convert this into a lot of state patronage. And then it became this sort of modernist showcase in the 1950s. They put up a lot of skyscrapers, a lot of great architecture and innovations, and it became a sort of El Dorado. A lot of waves of immigrants from Europe, post-war Europe, came to Venezuela as this land of opportunity. And then through the 1970s, it was seen as this beacon of democracy, stability, and economic progress. And so to see where it is now, you would think, well, how could this possibly happen? And in one sense, it's that there were always dysfunctions within Venezuelan society and political culture. And partly this was due to the fact that it's a petrostate, and it had all of the ills of a petrostate. People call it about the resource curse, how dependence on one commodity can warp an economy and incentives, so that all the smartest people in the country and the most ambitious, instead of actually kind of making stuff and kind of creating value, they all are kind of gravitate towards rent seeking, trying to kind of get profit off at this oil sector. Anyway, this is a long-winded way of saying that the country then decayed and kind of warped a bit. So beneath this gloss of success, by the 1980s, things were beginning to go wrong. And this dual-party democracy began to atrophy. And so then when the oil prices fell steeply in the 80s, they had no cushion, and that exposed the hollowness of the system. And so then enter Hugo Chavez as a lieutenant colonel in the army who stages a coup. Maybe I'm getting ahead of ourselves, but that's when Chavez explodes onto the national stage in 1992.
And so you had a situation where the facade was starting to break down. But what enabled Hugo Chavez to have the power to attempt the coup, for which, as I recall, it was attempted, it wasn't successful, he went to jail for 2 years. But what gave him kind of the ability to rise up and take the audacious act of basically saying, let's bring down the government?
People were jaded, disgusted with the government, with corruption, and with the sense that the system was no longer working for them. And so when Chavez staged this coup, militarily it was bungled, but he, as a communications genius that he was, he turned this fiasco into political success, because in surrendering, he went on television, and until then he'd been unknown. He was just a military officer. But he had learned from Manuel Noriega's capture in Panama just a few years earlier. When Noriega was captured, you may remember, he looked bedraggled, he was in a T-shirt, he was very undignified. And Chavez had remembered that, so when he surrendered, he made sure that he had his beret on, his uniform was crisp, he spoke very fluently, he's very articulate, and he took responsibility for the fiasco. And this actually electrified the country. People were like, my God, who is this guy? He seemed almost a romantic figure. And so that when he was sentenced, I think initially to people said he deserved 20 years in prison, 1 year for the coup and 19 years for failing. And this was yet against a democratically elected government. And so that was just the extent to which the system had then decayed. So when he did go to jail for just 2 years, he was then pardoned, and then he became a politician and was elected a few years later.
That's interesting. I go back to a story. I remember when I was in Caracas in the late 80s, if you wanted to go out to dinner and you had a nice car, you had to find somebody and pay them to watch your car, or your car was going to be stolen. And so that shows the decay that was happening in the late 80s, right prior to the coup. Now, as we move into the 90s, though, he actually got elected in 1998. So what was it that enabled him to, come out of the coup and actually run for government and win in a democratic environment?
By the late 90s, people in Venezuela were even more disgusted with the state of the country because because oil prices had fallen and the whole country was so dependent on oil that the government's traditional levers of patronage had atrophied, and people were angry. And of the candidates on offer, he was by far the angriest, and he was a platform for people, or a vehicle for people's disillusionment with the system. And so he channeled that very effectively because he was such a talented communicator. He could speak to audiences and vary his tone of speech, and he just came across as very authentic. In a way, there are echoes, arguably, of the United States 2016, that people wanted a kind of an avenger, and he was the chosen avenger.
Interesting. And so, talk to us about his policies. Once he got elected, what did he implement within Venezuela?
Well, initially they were quite mushy. He was never quite ideologically as radical as either he led on or as his detractors would say. I mean, for example, he denied that he was a socialist for, I think, about 5 years, for the first 5 years, and he spoke about these kind of Blairite third ways. He was a fan of Bill Clinton for a while, and it was only after the attempted coup against him in 2002 that he then became a bit more ideologically radical, became much more closer to Fidel Castro, and he imported help from Cuba to shore up his own government. So there was, at that point then, you saw these socialist policies, but the ruin of Venezuela of today really isn't rooted so much in the socialism as such. I think it's rooted in maybe three separate elements. One is the populism, and this was a system of just giving money away. It was just a very populist way of shoring up your support by basically giving away gasoline for free to the entire country, by increasing government ministries and hiring lots of people, giving more people government jobs, and creating a huge panoply of patronage, which was super expensive and punctured holes in the economy, but he was doing it. Another policy or fatal flaw was this sheer managerial incompetence. Now that sounds quite banal when we're talking about system collapse and revolution, but the incompetence when you were there was just so extraordinary. It was on steroids of just how they could screw things up so badly. And they were able to get away with this because they had so much money, because Chavez's great luck was that he arrived into power, and soon after oil prices exploded. I mean, they were about $8 a barrel when he took office, and then went up in a trajectory, this kind of a decade-long rise up to more than up to $140 a barrel. So he had about $1 trillion to play with, $1 trillion over that period in a country of 30 million people who were actually not that wealthy. So he had a huge amount of money to spend, and he just burned through it. And in that time, he managed to actually during this time of extraordinary oil bounty, the national debt increased sixfold. So when you think of the amount of money, it felt like when you were in Caracas, it was like raining money on them. And, so this created a whole new class of so-called boligarchs. This was a coinage of oligarchs and Bolivarians.
Yeah.
And so it just was a system of, I'll give you one anecdote, and where one time he, on his television show, he had this weekly TV show, which could be like a 7-hour stream of consciousness, where he would go around and he would do things. And one Sunday morning, and we as journalists, we would always watch it, because he would just make news. You never knew what he would do. And one morning, they filmed it in the center of Caracas. So it was like a mobile unit. And he was walking around the historic center of Caracas, being trailed by an entourage of ministers and aides and supporters. And he made it look spontaneous. And he kind of looked around and he pointed at a building and said, "Oh, what's that building over there?" And the mayor of Caracas kind of piped up and said, "Oh, well, that's a jewelry store, Mr. President." And then Chavez kind of feigns indignation, because everybody knew this was actually a very famous building. So it was like, I know Sears or, and he went, "A jewelry store, but Simón Bolívar used to live there. This is outrageous that this is a jewelry store. Expropiate.
Expropriate.
And, expropriate. And then, the entourage were looking at it as if like expecting to see flames shooting out of this, this store. And then he turned on this and pointed at another building. "And what's over there?" And the mayor said, "Oh, well, that's more stores." Chavez was so indignant. How can this kind of mammon here be, intruding on this national heritage, because Bolivar's aunt used to live in this building? No, expropriate it, because the national heritage, national dignity demands that we do this. And it was good kind of television and theater. But the point is that there was no plan B for that. So he expropriated these thriving businesses. And
including the oil industry too.
And yes, and this was like a microcosm of what happened nationally, which
Right.
is within a few months, I went and visited what had been these thriving stores, and they were boarded up. There was like a teenage soldier sitting in front, and they're already looking derelict, and vagrants hanging outside, and they were shuttered. And Chavez had promised that they're going to build some great new kind of museums and make it a cultural hub and do all these great things. And instead, he just killed the business, killed all the jobs, and then it became just a derelict site. Now you apply that on a macro scale to the oil, the oil company, the airlines, the factories that used to make cars, the agriculture. This was the pattern of just kind of making stuff up on the fly and then making a hash of it, and so that and while they again had so much money, it didn't seem to matter so much, because they could always kind of buy their way out of trouble. But as we now see, eventually the money ran out.
And so now the Great Recession comes along in 2008, 2009. What happens in Venezuela? And of course, that's about the time when he's diagnosed with cancer, is it not? Because he passed away in 2013. But what's he do at that time where the oil prices collapse? Did his policies change, or how did he manage in that environment?
Well, again, he was very lucky with timing in that oil prices were staying just high enough whilst he was still alive. And the cracks were showing in the system. You could see it. I remember going out to with these agricultural co-ops in the countryside back in 2008, and you could see then the unfolding fiasco that they were trying to grow their own food and fix the agriculture, and you could see it that they were making a mess of it. And by 2012. The economy was really having big problems, but Chavez, and this, he had almost had to kind of give full respect for this. He pulled off a double magic trick in 2012. Firstly, he was dying of cancer, but he pretended that he was cured. He said it was a miracle from God that he had been cured. And he then proceeded to campaign because there was an election in 2012. And he, in the advanced stages of cancer, was pretending to be cured. And he went on a stage, I remember this, it was extraordinary. And he was literally dancing. It was a pouring torrential tropical downpour. And he was one of the, like a sort of a victory rally in the last days of campaigning. Torrential downpours, and he was dressed in black, and he was on stage, and he was dancing. I mean, he was more energy than Justin Timberlake at the Super Bowl. I mean, seriously, you had to see the guy. He was dancing for hours. He was, he had this huge crowd in the palm of his hand, and he made jokes about the rain, and he projected the sense of immortality. And this was the guy, again, I repeat, he was months away from death, and he'd been suffering. And he must have been in agony, in physical torment, and yet he was projecting the sense that he'd been cured. Simultaneous to this, the second magic trick was that the economy, meantime, was also on life support. But they borrowed a lot of money from China, and they started printing lots of money, and they confected a boom. And so they made it look like there was money more raining down on the economy, and so that they would be giving people free apartments, they'd be giving people free mattresses, free food, hiring people for more, creating another government ministry, here are more jobs, and so forth, to give this kind of feel-good effect, which was completely artificial and completely unsustainable, but it worked because he won. He won that last election when he was dying and the economy was about to go into a tailspin, and yet he actually won a majority of votes.
And then at that time, he also hand-selected his successor, Nicolás Maduro, and Maduro came in without the same type of charisma, and now he's had to manage over the last 5 years in this environment. So what's that been like? How has that transition take place, and how is he perceived in Venezuela?
It's become from a kind of black comedy to farce to just pure tragedy at this point, because Maduro, I mean, he was unlucky in that all of the problems that Chavez had kind of successfully concealed through his wonderful capacity for theater and for distraction. I mean, I could give you 101 stories or examples of the way Chavez could just distract us, from just like certain other presidents. He could pick ways to have us talk about something else other than, the problems of the day. And now Maduro, firstly, lacked Chavez's talent for distraction. He tries, but he just doesn't have Chavez's ability to the same charisma. Oil prices, of course, have fallen very steeply since Maduro took office. And thirdly, the accumulation of problems that Chavez had bequeathed to Maduro. For example, the price controls, exchange rate controls. And these may sound like kind of nerdy issues when you're talking about it, kind of the scale of the humanitarian disaster unfolding there, but actually exchange controls is one of the keys to understanding how Venezuela is so ruined. And what Maduro did was he made it worse. I mean, instead of having the pragmatism of Chavez, who always, despite the rhetorical thunder that he would give about the empire, he was always a lot more pragmatic than he led on, whereas Maduro was much more ideologically rigid and is also not as strong as Chavez had been in terms of taking unpopular decisions. So Maduro, instead of actually trying to introduce some kind of painful but necessary reforms, has doubled down, and so which of course has triggered a backlash among people who are now, because he is so unpopular, that we've seen the street protests. And whereas Chavez was always able to more or less stay on one side of authoritarianism, he was an elected autocrat, and to this day, forevermore, people will debate, was he a dictator or not? In my view, he wasn't. He was an elected autocrat. It was a hybrid. And he didn't want to cross the line because he wanted the legitimacy of being elected and being seen to be popularly elected. Whereas Maduro can no longer afford that luxury, inverted commas. And so we now see these increasingly visible authoritarian steps taken by the government to simply retain power, retain control. And that's what it boils down to now purely, is that the revolution is purely a rhetorical device for a group, the ruling clique, to retain power.
So what's it like living in Venezuela? If you're a common person in Venezuela today, and you want to go about your business, buying food, sending your kids to school. What's that like for an everyday person?
Claustrophobic. I go back, my wife is Venezuelan, so my in-laws are Venezuelan. I go back to visit them. I'll tell you, when we travel now, frankly, it's like a traveling caravan because the amount of stuff we bring. Now remember, this is a petrostate, the biggest oil reserves in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia, relatively small population, verdant climate. In theory, they can produce all of their own food. They should be a food exporter. What we bring in our suitcases, we pack it with rice, cooking oil, toilet paper, pasta, medicines, bandages. And this is all the stuff that I used to bring to Havana. When I was based in Caracas and I would do reporting trips to Cuba, I had friends in Havana. I would bring also like shampoo and soaps, and then you bring them to friends in Cuba, and that would leave them. That's what we now bring to Venezuela. And I never thought, even when I could see the fiasco unfolding under Chavez, I never anticipated things could get this bad, where it's complete collapse. And there's something called the Maduro Diet, which is that now that food has become so scarce, that people have actually, on average, it's when studied, people have lost about 19 pounds of weight in the last 18 months. And you see it. I've seen my in-laws. I was shocked. I couldn't believe one of my in-laws, I mean, he shriveled. He always kind of a tubby guy, and now, I wouldn't say skeletal, but certainly has that kind of lean, hungry look. And people are, because they simply don't have enough food. And we're talking about the middle class. In this case, one guy's pension used to be, as my brother-in-law's, like about $1,000, the equivalent. Now his pension is about $4 a month.
Wow.
$4 a month.
Because of inflation.
Yeah. Yes, inflation. And when you hear about inflation and hyperinflation, you see statistics like, oh, it's 200%, 900%, 2,000%. You know that's bad. But when you actually see the human cost, it's horrific. It destroys lives, literally so, because when you have families who can no longer afford medicines for example, for diabetes, epilepsy, and you have a child dying, choking to death because they can no longer afford medicines, which a year earlier they could afford, and now they can't. So people go on social media and they go like Radio Bemba to try to like figure out ways like to sort out, to source medicines, and it's no longer working because the medicines simply aren't even there anymore. So to conclude on this, why it's claustrophobic, it's all of this is happening, and at the same time, you have this complete insecurity and crime. Because at least in Cuba, at least I was in a proper dictatorship, the streets are more or less safe unless you're a political dissident. In Venezuela, that's not the case. It is. There are criminal gangs that go out. The police are themselves often the biggest criminals. They moonlight as kidnappers. There's a de facto curfew. By 6 p.m., people, if you have any sense, you go home because you don't want to be out on the streets at night. Because awful things happen, and now increasingly there are home invasions, so even in your own home you're no longer safe. Thieves break into schools. If they hear that there's been a delivery of food to a school, they'll break into the school, they will steal the food. Two of my best friends in Caracas, they were broken into quite recently. Their neighbors were also broken into, and their neighbors were stabbed in their beds. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but the point is you have this system where you can no longer buy enough food, you can't get enough medicine, and you're actually afraid to go out because people because of thieves. And there's one last anecdote is there used to be in Venezuela the kind of macho culture and renowned for the beauty of its women, etc. In Latin America, people now, when they're people walking down the street, people don't look at and give wolf whistles for the beauty of some perceived or otherwise of another person. They're looking at their bags to see if they've got food. Not necessarily because they want to rob them, because if they see someone in a shopping bag and they see that they have flour or oil, their eyes will bulge. It's like, where did you get that? And people then get very self-conscious about carrying food, so you have to hide it. You have to triple bag it so people don't know it. And that's why it's incredibly claustrophobic. And so, frankly, I still love going back to Venezuela. Now it's a complete ordeal.
So what's the opposition party doing? I know Leopoldo Lopez was put in jail, but does it have any strength? Is there any way that they can combat what has become a dictatorship now?
One of the reasons the government there is so entrenched, of many reasons, but one is that the opposition is fractious. They're perpetually infighting. They've always had a problem to relate, frankly, with the majority of Venezuelans. And the government, Chavez was a master at this, and Maduro is actually quite wily as well at playing the oppositions off against each other, kind of divide and rule strategy. And so admittedly, the opposition has a tough task when some of their most charismatic candidates are disqualified. Either they're arrested and thrown in jail, they're hounded into exile, or they're accused of corruption and therefore they're disbarred from running for office. But they also have a capacity to shoot themselves in both feet. And so there is a sense of despair that the opposition really often just doesn't get its act together. And now they've got a horrendous challenge, which is that the government has called this snap election in April, which will be completely undemocratic because the government the system is so rigged in favor of the government, and has been for many, many years. Successive elections have been rigged, but the rigging has got worse and worse and worse, to the point that now it's just completely blatant and shameless.
So what do you think the international community should do now? You have a failed state like this, you're bound to get lots of people migrating, and they already are doing it, to Colombia. They'll try to get in the United States, et cetera. It's very similar to what's happening in the Middle East with Syria. What should the international community do?
Well, step number one, don't invade. Please do not invade Venezuela. It would be, ethically speaking aside, this would be a disaster. And I say that because there's been chatter. Rex Tillerson and Donald Trump have hinted at it, that there may be some military intervention and so forth. And that would just be a disaster, I think, for two reasons. One, Venezuela does have its own military. They have also these kind of citizen militias. And the government does retain some support of perhaps 20% of the population, maybe a bit more. So things get very messy. Sure, some Venezuelans are crying out for intervention/liberation, as they would see it, and they would throw rose petals on an invading force. But basically we would have seen this movie before, not in Venezuela, but it would not end happily. Secondly, even if there was a successful regime change in terms of toppling it, such that the successor governments would be seen as illegitimate in the eyes of many Venezuelans, and it would be tarred with the original sin of Yankee intervention, gringo imperialism, and certainly the rest of the region could not possibly tolerate or give a pass to this intervention. So, and maybe the third reason of why, and also I think this will not happen, is that Venezuela's tragedy in many ways is self-contained, because yes, there is some spillover. We see now this historic reversal of Venezuelan refugees basically spilling over into Colombia, as after decades of Colombians as refugees come in seeking refuge in Venezuela, the traffic is now reversed. Likewise, Venezuelans seeking refuge in Brazil. I've come across Venezuelans in Mexico now doing jobs that Venezuelans would never previously have considered. But it's not. But so far it's been the flight of the middle class, and they're the ones who are able to get out. And so it's not a humanitarian catastrophe of the boat people yet, and it may never quite reach that stage. So it's not like the international community has to intervene for the sake of its own national security, because a bit like, say, in Haiti or, say, in Congo in Africa, where tragedy might unfold, but it doesn't necessarily spell disaster for the rest of the region. And in a way, that's bad news for Venezuelans, because it means that the rest of the international community can, to some extent, afford to sit on its hands and just let the tragedy play itself out.
So what about the upper class? Do you have many people who have already fled because they have the means to do so, to go to other Latin American countries? So has it been decimated, or do you still have people running businesses? You know, it used to be a big producer of rum, for example. There was a lot of meat produced there. Are those people still in power, or has that been all ceded to the middle class through the revolutionary or socialist policies?
Well, hyperinflation has more or less wiped out the middle class as an economic force, and those Venezuelans who had the resources and, frankly, the initiative to get out have more or less gone. Estimates range from 1 to 2 million people, and unfortunately, that so far has been mostly the best educated and the best and the brightest in many ways. So, what you have left are those who are struggling to get out because geographically it's not easy to, like, where do you go? You can't get on a boat, and where you're going to go to Cuba or Haiti. You know, I mean, it's tough. So, and unfortunately, I think that the current situation, you could say it's not sustainable, but in some ways it is. I mean, it may continue indefinitely. Especially now that oil prices are recovering a bit. Although Venezuela's national oil company is in a desperate strait. This will give the government some breathing room. I mean, they may yet default this year, but the recovery of oil prices will give the government a little bit more money to play with. And, it's possible Nicolás Maduro will still be president there in 15 years' time.
Wow. So how would Maduro, what he needs is foreign reserves and he needs foreign investment. How would he go about doing that, whether it be from the United States, Europeans, China? China's been playing quite extensively in Latin America. Are there chances that he would have the ability to bring in foreign investment to help correct the situation?
Well, they're scraping the barrel now because they've already mortgaged their oil fields out a long time ago. I remember actually being at a press conference with Chavez, one of his kind of final press conferences, when back in 2011, I think, by then the Chinese were getting worried that that the Venezuelans were screwing up all the billions that the Chinese were lending Hugo Chavez. So they came and were worried. So even then they were doing it. But the point of this anecdote was that I remember Chavez came to this press conference. He put a brave face on the fact that the Chinese had come to wag their finger at him and say, look, you got to get your act together because otherwise you're never going to be able to pay us back. And Chavez claimed that this was a part of solidarity with the heirs of Mao Zedong, and which of course the Chinese were mortified. I mean, it's not a name they necessarily like to hear in that context. But what struck me at that time when Chavez was giving this very kind of bombastic claim of the revolution was a beacon for the world, etc., was that he was speaking from Miraflores Palace in Caracas, and first the decay of the revolution was writ literally in the facade of the palace, where you could see the paintwork was chipped, it was peeling, there were tiles missing. Remember, Chavez was talking, he was in his green uniform, he had these big red boots on, and I was just looking, like, there's tiles missing from the roof of the palace, and this is where the cameras were pointing at. I mean, this is supposed to be, like this is their White House. And then there's also a smell of urine from the gardens. And then also I'd heard through a government minister that in Chavez's private elevator inside the palace, rainwater was leaking inside the elevator. And so this was a symptom of the decay of the system, even at its supposed near zenith. Now that was in 2011. So fast forward to now, and the creditors are extremely worried because the Venezuelans, they are running out of things to mortgage out. So which is why there's a real possibility that they will default this year. And that will be a disaster for the government because that means that their oil tankers could be impounded. Citgo, you may see this in the US, as the Venezuelan subsidiary, could be taken over. And so, I mean, they really are. That's why I think if oil prices surge a bit, this may stave off this final disaster.
It's hard to see how long you could stave it off, too, especially with the changes that are happening in the world. And they used to have a really close relationship with Cuba. Is that still, and they used to provide, a lot of petrol to the Cubans. Is that still a tight relationship under Maduro? And is there any help that could come from Cuba?
Yes, because Maduro himself trained and was educated as a young man. He went to Cuba and studied under, as kind of a school set up by Fidel Castro. And he ideologically has always been on the more kind of in the Cuban wing of the ruling party in Venezuela. Whereas Chavez was actually often much more independent in some ways from the Cubans, whereas Maduro has embraced them very tightly. And the Venezuelan security apparatus has a lot of Cuban agents or intelligence agents dotted around the system. So they do rely on Cuban support and expertise, also for surveillance and so on. I don't really make that much of a secret of it. And so, but I think the Cubans are frankly smarter, and they are having suffered when the Soviet Union collapsed and its subsidies collapsed. The Cubans are doing their best to wean themselves off Venezuelan oil, because there is now less Venezuelan oil than there used to be, because Venezuela simply doesn't even have the wherewithal to pump its own oil. And they can't pay foreign people to companies to do it as much as before. So the Cubans are trying to wean themselves off a bit. For example, that's why they want more tourism and from the United States. But there is still this very close symbiotic relationship between Havana and Caracas.
So, are there any other Latin American countries that could come to the rescue here? And could this type of Chavismo dictatorship be exported? Because I go back to the 70s when I grew up in Latin America, and most places were dictatorships at the time, and it took a long time to wean them off and go to democratic elected environments. But as you have the prospect of a failed state, what are the chances that as those people migrate outwards and that state collapses, you could have other dictatorships coming back to fruition, so to speak?
If they do, it won't be because of Venezuela, I think, because it's such a failed model. It's almost financially bankrupt, morally bankrupt, politically bankrupt, that even its kind of left-wing allies are somewhat mortified at what's happening. So as a model, nobody certainly aspires to emulate that. And I think Venezuela was so kind of sui generis in terms of just the dynamics of Chavez's personality and it being a petrostate. And you don't have that in other countries in Latin America. So I don't think there's a risk of contagion in that sense. What there is a risk of, and what we already see happening in Latin America, is an authoritarian streak in other countries whereby term limits are being removed. We see Evo Morales trying to do that in Bolivia, and the same thing's happening in Honduras. So that's worrying. But at the same time, in Ecuador, we've just seen Ecuadorian voters
voted against it.
Yeah, so that's quite encouraging that they're standing up for their own, for checks and balances. So I think if these other countries like Honduras, etc., go pear-shaped, it won't be Venezuelan contagion. It'll be their own dynamic of and their own kind of fragility of their own systems.
So when kids come out of college, a lot of times they want to go backpack through South America, and what would be your recommendation for Venezuela? Do you think it would be wise to go through there at this point in time? Because they have some beautiful beaches. There's some really nice places to stay.
Yeah. Well, I used to meet a lot of people from the Bay Area when I lived in Caracas. There were a lot of so-called solidarity tours. So a lot of young people from Berkeley and elsewhere would come to Venezuela to study what was happening. And at the time, often they thought it was great. This system was, a new Jerusalem was being built, and there was, frankly, a certain naivete there. But they would enjoy it, because, as you said, the beaches are great. Venezuelans are wonderful people, and they have a great capacity to find humor, black humor now in the bleakest situation, and that, in a sense, is what keeps them going. So, but the pain that people are suffering now, that I think and insecurity and just the logistics of you can't use a credit card. You have to change money on the black market. You might get kidnapped, etc. It would be very difficult, I think, to do that. So I wouldn't recommend backpacking in Venezuela right now.
How about in Latin America in general? How is it these days? I mean, both in Central America with Honduras, you still have issues in Nicaragua. Other places as you move through the Latin American area.
Well, I loved. Guatemala. It's got Petén. It's great. And Nicaragua is actually relatively safe. El Salvador and Honduras less so. But there's some great places. I think Latin America overall, the exception being some certain countries in Central America, but I think it's got a lot safer. And it's quite easy to backpack and function. Use credit cards. A little bit of Spanish goes a long way. So I loved my own time kind of backpacking there. Although I think the last time I was in a tent was in the desert for the Los 33, the miners in Chile. But so I recommend it. I'm a Latin American nerd, and I just unfortunately for now do avoid Venezuela.
That's tough. So how about when you think of other political actors there, is there anybody that's trying to influence Venezuela, to take over a lot of the riches? I was reading in The Economist that, again, the oil production in Maracaibo has just plummeted. It's down to about 80% of what it once, it's 20% of what it once was. And so would there be a chance that another country would come in and invade it for its resources?
I would doubt it because it's so, frankly, so dysfunctional now, Venezuela. Anybody who would invade would need to have a very good plan B for what happens next because, financially, logistically, there's so many problems there that I couldn't see why. In any case, now the United States oil production, shale production, etc., is increasing. Iraq and Libya, of all places, are now turning up the spigots. So there's no shortage of oil supplies in the world. So there's no real need for Venezuela's oil. There would be an effect in the US if overnight Venezuela stopped producing oil altogether. Americans would feel it in their pocketbook to the extent that refineries in the southern United States would suddenly stop having this heavy crude to process, and oil prices would jump up a bit, but not as much as before because Venezuela is already producing so much less. So that's why I think this tragedy can just continue unfolding without any intervention really from the outside. The one
not even from Russia, or
well, they want their money. But that they would, I think, to seize assets rather than invading. It would just be a matter of seizing Citgo or Venezuelan oil tankers and so forth, or financial assets that are still sitting in bank accounts. That rather than physical invasion. The other matter you asked, to go back to your question about what can the outsiders do. Well, sanctions is the one thing which is already happening. They started under the Obama administration, and the Trump administration has tightened them, and actually they are impacting on the ruling caste in Venezuela. They are bristling at the sanctions. They do feel the effect. They don't say it publicly because obviously they don't want to encourage more sanctions, but they are hurting. And so far they've been relatively targeted, which I think is a very good thing. And I think it's conceivable that more sanctions, not wider sanctions, and certainly not like stopping buying oil, but again, more targeted sanctions on the small ruling clique could have an effect because they will want a way out. And this could give the opposition a bit of leverage because the opposition could then be speaking to the international community about sanctions and so forth. So, there's a bit of hope, which is that the sanctions could give some leverage to outsiders and to the opposition to rein in some of the excesses of the government.
So what's your prescription for Venezuela? What would you do at this point in time, given what you know and you've seen evolve over the last 30 years? What's their way out? What's their way to success?
I think at this point survival would suffice. It's really sad because Also, just culturally, the values, you hear that a lot from Venezuelans when you're there. They just say about the values of people, like they have been eroded. And so it's a matter of institutions and mentality, and it's so many problems, and it's so deeply rooted that, success, forget it at the moment. It's just merely survival and trying to, for people to have enough food and medicine is the priority for now. That, and hopefully, in a sense, to maybe try to restore some of the democratic checks and balances which had existed before. For instance, trying to, instead of rushing to have this, what will be a completely unfair election in April, what would be nice to have would be to have a later election this year that would be monitored by actual proper international monitors with a genuinely independent electoral watchdog running it. I mean, this at this point looks like a fantasy, but in theory that could happen, and that could then give the opposition some semblance of a power base, and maybe also encourage some elements in the government to either ameliorate some of their policies or to defect. I mean, that's not a hopeful scenario, frankly, but it's the best I've got.
And so, what about the prospect of rogue military leaders seeing how much the country is decayed, and they basically staging a coup against Maduro to take over for the good of the people?
The chances of that are quite small because it's a quasi-military government already. Military officers, generals, admirals, many of them are government ministers, many of them are state governors, some of them are mayors. The new head of the oil company is a military man. And Maduro has done this to shore up his support. Chavez, this is taking a page out of Chavez's playbook. And what he's done, he's given the generals a big space at the trough for corruption. And this, again, is not new in Venezuela. So these generals are themselves very corrupt. They have a very strong incentive for this government to stay in power, because they would fear that if this government fell, that they would then be exposed not just to losing their jobs, but of going to jail and possibly being extradited for narco trafficking. So you have, so at this level, the senior military leadership is very closely wedded to keeping this government in power. The levels below that, maybe colonels and majors, they're not. They have to maybe 2 steps back from the trough, so they don't have as much incentive necessarily to keep the government in power. But they, for the time being, we haven't really seen any serious evidence of a coup.
So you talked a little bit about narco trafficking. Talk a little bit more about that. If you have, it's a petro state. If oil collapses and you have to figure out how to get, hard currency, how significant is narco trafficking in Venezuela now?
Well, it has been significant for at least a decade, because the government under Chavez forged close links with the FARC in Colombia, the guerrillas. And the FARC, of course, were making a lot of their money through narco trafficking. And increasingly under this, the system in Venezuela, it became a funnel for Colombian drugs. It would go from Colombia to Venezuela, and then maybe Central America, and then the United States. Chavez turned a blind eye to the fact that his own generals and officers were enriching themselves, because in that way he bought their loyalty, because it meant that they had a strong incentive to keep the system going, and also they knew that they were now vulnerable should Chavez ever fall, that they could be extradited. So in a sense, he bought their loyalty whilst allowing the system to become corrupt. And I remember that, it was almost funny that, traditionally military men would be nervous about going to the border because there were guerrillas. It might be, it was insecure. This is the Colombian border. But under Chavez, actually, the military all wanted to go to the border because that's where you could get a position at the trough, for drug trafficking. And so it goes to the very highest levels. And Nicolás Maduro, his wife, 2 of her nephews were caught for narco trafficking last year, and there's so many anecdotes about. But there's a cartel, the El Cartel de los Soles. It's a nickname of a cartel named after the insignia on the Venezuelan military uniforms. The point being, the Venezuelan military is so deeply embedded in narco trafficking now that, again, it gives them such a strong incentive to keep either Maduro in power or just keep this system in power, because, kick away that regime, and it's game over for them.
So, paint me a picture of what you think Venezuela will look like in 2030.
Have you seen Mad Max?
That bad?
It could slowly become Haiti. Because remember, some people used to say that it was Haiti. Yes, it could, in a sense, become like a simmering, problem where deep corruption and poverty are entrenched, and which means that child mortality rates are high and so forth, and that just becomes normalized, and that the system that's just the way it is. And as I said, the global system, the global oil market has already basically swallowed the fact that Venezuela's oil production has dwindled. So this collapse wouldn't even necessarily impact or cause shockwaves across the international system. So, yeah, I'm going to call it a prediction, but my fear is that we're just going to see continued erosion, atrophy, anomie, and the destruction of a country and a society.
So if we have some Venezuelans in the audience here, they're probably pretty, bummed out at this point in time. So paint me a best case scenario by 2030, and what would happen there?
Best case. Okay. Elections are held later this year that are actually at least quasi-fair. The opposition produces a credible candidate, and they unite around him or her. The candidate will almost certainly lose, but that they could then perhaps become a rallying force for them to become, the opposition to become an actual viable potential alternative government, and that the government loses control, hopefully not in a way that's catastrophic, and that the opposition could win. Just like I was in Serbia, ex-Yugoslavia, when Milosevic lost control, and actually wasn't that bloody, and he fell, and the outcome in the end was actually surprisingly good. And so that sense that civil society can recover, and I think with even just a minimal degree of economic sanity, Venezuela could begin to dig itself out of a hole, because it does sit on the world's biggest oil reserves. So you could see sprouts of recovery and optimism. I'm groping here because, frankly, it's just been so difficult to see any reason for optimism in the short to medium term. So in 2030, I would settle simply to see a country where children were not malnourished and where basic medicines were available.
But you could be in a situation where if the opposition were to gain control at some point in time by some miracle, so to speak, they could implement policies which would be more favorable towards foreign investment. And then the United States, China, other countries would then come back and be happy to invest in the country.
Yes, but clearing up the financial mess, that would be so huge, because their debt burden is now so huge that they really have mortgaged out their oil fields for so much that to bring in foreign investment, you have to promise foreign investors a lot. You'd have to give them such generous terms to induce them really to come back in that, for sure, quite quickly you would find cries of sellout, neoliberalism, neo-imperialism, and so forth, and that could actually in its own way create a backlash. So I don't know. But yes, in theory, yes, foreign investors would want to come back in, but only if conditions looked at least semi-sane.
So how could the international community prevent another Venezuela from happening without, getting involved in day-to-day politics and day-to-day running of the government? what tools can they use to prevent other failed states?
Not sure. That's not the United States' job, and it shouldn't. I mean, we've seen the mess they made in Latin America, in Guatemala in 1954, Salvador Allende in Chile, etc. So the U.S. Certainly doesn't have the moral weight to do that. And I spent a year in Iraq after the invasion, so I saw the mess there. So, and we've seen, nation-building attempts in Afghanistan. So I don't really think it's the U.S.'s role to do that, and especially just given their history has been often quite ignoble in Latin America. So I just think that they should try to be a good neighbor, and yes, try to nurture democracy and fair trade deals and so forth. But really, I don't see the U.S.'s role to be a policeman in the region.
It's interesting. So I'd like to say good night to our radio listeners and thank Rory Carroll for his excellent discussion. Many thanks as well to you, the audience, for your terrific questions. And now I'd like to give a round of applause for Rory. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.